Life has a way of teaching unforgettable lessons, especially to those who judge others without knowing their true worth. In a quiet suburban neighborhood of Boston, where historic homes line streets shaded by century-old maple trees, a story of prejudice, power, and poetic justice would soon unfold. The Richardson family had called their beautiful Victorian home their sanctuary for the past 5 years. With its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden, it was where their 2 children learned to ride bikes, where summer barbecues brought together friends and neighbors, and where countless memories were made. As a family that had achieved the American dream through hard work and determination, they never imagined their peaceful life would be disrupted by something as archaic as racial prejudice. Everything changed when their longtime landlord passed away, and his son, Richard Conway, inherited the property. Conway, a real estate developer from out of state, had his own vision for the neighborhood, one that apparently didn't include families like the Richardsons. The subtle discrimination began with ignored maintenance requests, escalated to unexpected inspections, and culminated in a notice to vacate based on fabricated lease violations. What Conway didn't know, however, was that Michael Richardson wasn't just another tenant he could bully. As the newly appointed federal judge for the district court, Michael had spent his entire career fighting for justice and equality. Yet, watching his wife comfort their crying children after another confrontational visit from Conway, he struggled to maintain his professional composure. "Daddy, do we have to leave our home?" his 8-year-old daughter asked one evening, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. The pain in her eyes struck deeper than any legal brief he'd ever encountered. His wife, Sarah, a community pediatrician, squeezed his hand, her silent strength grounding him as always. The neighbors, who had witnessed Conway's increasingly aggressive behavior, began documenting every incident. Mrs. Chen from next door recorded Conway's racist remarks during one of his unannounced visits. The Peterson family across the street saved copies of the Richardsons' consistently timely rent payments, contradicting Conway's false claims of late payments. As Conway prepared to file his eviction lawsuit, he remained blissfully unaware that he was about to learn a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumption. The certified letter he received requesting his presence in federal court left him confused. The formal header caught his attention, but he hadn't processed the significance of the name he'd been discriminating against for months. In the courthouse parking lot, Conway straightened his tie, confident that his expensive lawyer would handle this minor inconvenience. After all, he'd handled many evictions before. But as he approached the courthouse steps, he noticed an unusual buzz among the gathered crowd. Local news vans lined the street, and conversations hushed as he passed by. What awaited Conway behind those heavy wooden doors would shake his worldview to its core. The story of what happened next would not only change one man's prejudiced perspective, but would also inspire a community to stand united against discrimination. Sometimes, justice arrives in unexpected packages, wearing not just a black robe, but also the dignity of a father protecting his family, a husband supporting his wife, and a professional who had earned his position through decades of dedicated service. As Conway pushed through those courthouse doors, he was about to discover that his attempts to judge a family by their skin color would lead to him being judged by a very different standard, the law itself. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Conway made his way to the defendant's table. His confident stride faltered when he noticed the unusual number of spectators filling the benches. Local civil rights activists, community members, and even a few real estate developers he knew personally sat watching with intent expressions. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and commanding. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Richardson." The color drained from Conway's face as he watched the very man he'd been harassing for months ascend to the bench. Judge Richardson, dressed in his judicial robes, carried himself with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout their previous encounters, though Conway had been too blinded by prejudice to recognize it then. Sarah Richardson sat in the front row, her presence both supporting her husband and bearing witness to justice in action. Beside her sat their children's former babysitter, an elderly white woman who had helped raise Conway himself, a detail that would soon add another layer of irony to the proceedings. As Judge Richardson recused himself from the case due to obvious conflict of interest, he introduced his colleague, Judge Patricia Henderson, who would be presiding over the matter. Conway's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation his client had created. The evidence began mounting. Mrs. Chen's recordings played clearly through the courtroom speakers, Conway's voice unmistakable as he made discriminatory remarks about changing the neighborhood's character. The Peterson family's documented history of the Richardsons' impeccable payment record directly contradicted Conway's claims of lease violations. But it was the testimony of Conway's own former nanny that delivered the most powerful blow. She recounted how she had helped raise both Conway and Michael Richardson, though decades apart. "I watched one of these boys grow up to become a federal judge," she testified, her voice steady but disappointed, "and the other seems to have forgotten everything I taught him about treating people with dignity and respect." Community members took the stand one by one, painting a picture of the Richardsons as valued neighbors who had contributed significantly to local initiatives. The president of the PTA spoke about Sarah's volunteer work at school health fairs. The local youth basketball coach described Michael's dedication to mentoring young players every weekend, regardless of his demanding career. Conway's lawyer attempted to argue that the eviction notice was purely business-related, but emails discovered during discovery told a different story. Messages to potential new tenants promised to upgrade the neighborhood's profile. Thinly veiled language that the prosecution argued was code for racial discrimination. As the evidence continued to unfold, Conway sat slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions visible in his posture. The realization that he had not only attacked a federal judge, but had also betrayed the values of the very woman who helped raise him seemed to age him visibly. The courthouse steps had become a gathering place for community members showing support for the Richardson family. Signs reading, "Hate has no home here," and "Justice for all," were held high by people from all walks of life. Local news crews captured the growing crowd, their presence ensuring that this story of discrimination and its consequences would reach far beyond the courthouse walls. Inside, as Judge Henderson called for a brief recess, Conway watched the Richardson children in the hallway, laughing with their friends from school. Children of various backgrounds playing together without a hint of the prejudice that had clouded his own judgment. The sight seemed to trigger something in him, a memory perhaps of his own childhood lessons about right and wrong, lessons he had chosen to forget. But would this realization come too late? As the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, the question hanging in the air was not just about the fate of a house, but about the possibility of redemption and the power of justice to transform hearts and minds. As the trial resumed, an unexpected piece of evidence emerged that sent whispers rippling through the courtroom. Conway's personal assistant, unable to bear the weight of her conscience any longer, approached the prosecution with a series of recorded conversations. These recordings revealed Conway's systematic targeting of minority tenants across multiple properties, with the Richardson family being just one piece of a larger discriminatory pattern. The assistant's hands trembled as she testified about the coded language used in office meetings, the preferred tenant profiles that mysteriously excluded certain demographics, and the unofficial policies that made life difficult for residents who didn't fit Conway's vision of an ideal neighborhood. Each word she spoke seemed to sink Conway deeper into his chair. Outside the courthouse, the story had caught fire across social media. Other tenants from Conway's properties began coming forward with their own experiences of discrimination. The case was no longer just about the Richardson family. It had become a spotlight on housing discrimination that still persisted in seemingly progressive communities. Sarah Richardson, maintaining her composure throughout the proceedings, finally took the stand. She described how their children had started having nightmares after Conway's intimidating visits, how their daughter had begun asking if being different was wrong, and how their son had started packing his favorite toys every night, afraid they'd have to leave suddenly. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke, her words painting a vivid picture of the human cost of discrimination. Conway's attorney, sensing the mounting evidence against his client, attempted a desperate move. He proposed a private settlement, hoping to avoid the public reckoning that seemed increasingly inevitable. But the Richardsons stood firm. This case had become bigger than their family. It was about every family who had ever faced discrimination in silence, afraid to fight back. During a tense cross-examination, Conway's carefully constructed facade began to crack. When questioned about his childhood relationship with his former nanny, the same woman who had later cared for Michael Richardson, he struggled to reconcile his current actions with the values she had instilled in him. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face as he grappled with his own contradictions. A pivotal moment came when Judge Henderson ordered Conway to read aloud from his own emails. His voice shook as he recited his words about maintaining neighborhood standards and preserving property values, euphemisms that now stood exposed for what they truly were. The same words that had once seemed businesslike on paper now echoed through the courtroom, heavy with their true meaning. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew electric as Judge Henderson prepared to deliver her ruling. Conway, now visibly sweating, loosened his tie. His attorney shuffled papers nervously, while the prosecution sat quietly confident. The Richardson family held hands in the front row, their presence a testament to dignity under pressure. But before the judge could speak, Conway suddenly raised his hand, requesting permission to address the court. The unexpected interruption sent murmurs through the courtroom. Judge Henderson, after a moment's consideration, granted his request. Conway stood slowly, his expensive suit no longer projecting the confidence it once did. As he turned to face the Richardsons, the courtroom held its breath. Would this be a genuine moment of realization and remorse, or another calculated attempt to escape consequences? The answer hung in the air as Conway opened his mouth to speak, his voice carrying the weight of a man standing at a crucial crossroads between perpetuating prejudice and embracing change. Just as Conway began to speak, the courtroom doors burst open. An elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse, made his way down the center aisle. The unexpected entrance drew all eyes, but it was Conway's visible shock that suggested this wasn't just another spectator. The man was Robert Conway Sr., Richard Conway's father, and the original owner of the Richardsons' home, who everyone believed had passed away. The senior Conway, who had actually been recovering from a severe stroke in a private facility, had regained enough strength to come forward after learning of his son's actions through his caretakers. His presence changed everything. Not only was he very much alive, but he was still legally the property owner. His son's inheritance and subsequent actions had been based on a premature assumption of his death during his lengthy hospitalization. Robert Conway Sr.'s nurse helped him position his wheelchair near the judge's bench. Though his speech was slightly impaired from the stroke, his mind was sharp as he requested to address the court. Judge Henderson, recognizing the potential significance of this development, granted permission. What he revealed next left the courtroom in stunned silence. The elder Conway explained how Judge Michael Richardson, before becoming a judge, had been the pro bono attorney who had helped him fight predatory developers trying to force him out of his property 15 years ago. It was this experience that had led him to rent to the Richardson family specifically, seeing in them the same values of community and justice that had helped save his own home years before. Richard Conway's face turned ashen as his father continued. The senior Conway revealed how he had intentionally kept the property in his name, having witnessed his son's troubling business practices over the years. He spoke of how the stroke had left him temporarily unable to communicate, but he had been aware of everything happening with his property through his caretakers who read him the local news. The prosecution quickly moved to enter new evidence. The original property documents showing Robert Conway Sr. as the legal owner, along with medical records proving he had never been declared legally incompetent during his illness. Richard Conway's entire legal basis for the eviction crumbled in minutes. His own father had become the star witness against his discriminatory practices. But the elder Conway wasn't finished. With trembling hands, he pulled out a folder containing decades of documented instances where his son had engaged in similar discriminatory practices across various properties, information he had been collecting out of growing concern. The prosecuting attorney's eyes widened at this treasure trove of evidence that went far beyond the current case. The younger Conway, now cornered by his own father's testimony, attempted to object, claiming his father's medical condition made him an unreliable witness. But medical experts were ready to testify to Robert Conway Sr.'s mental competency, and his nurse had documented his long-held desire to stop his son's discriminatory practices. As this family drama unfolded in the courtroom, the Richardson children watched their former landlord's father demonstrate the very values their parents had taught them. standing up for what's right, even when it meant standing against your own family. That irony was lost on no one. The man who had tried to evict them based on prejudice was now facing justice because of his own father's moral courage. Judge Henderson called for another recess to review the new evidence, leaving the courtroom buzzing with tension. The younger Conway sat isolated at the defense table, abandoned even by his own attorney, who had asked to withdraw from the case. As the bailiff led everyone out, Robert Conway Sr. reached for Sarah Richardson's hand, tears in his eyes as he apologized for his son's actions. The story had transformed from a simple case of housing discrimination into a powerful testament to moral courage and the complexity of family bonds. When court resumed, Judge Henderson's courtroom had become standing room only. The tension was so thick you could hear a pin drop as she prepared to announce her ruling. But before she could begin, Richard Conway stood up, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and requested one final opportunity to address the court. This time, his voice carried none of its former arrogance. Looking directly at the Richardson family, he began to speak about growing up in a changing neighborhood, about the fears and prejudices he had inherited and never questioned, and about the shame of realizing that he had become exactly what his father had spent a lifetime fighting against. His prepared statement fell away as genuine emotion cracked through his carefully maintained facade. Then came the revelation that silenced the courtroom. Conway revealed that his own daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 5 years, had married a black man and had been trying to reconnect with him. His prejudices had cost him a relationship with not only his daughter, but also his grandchildren, children the same age as the Richardson kids. His voice broke as he admitted that his actions against the Richardsons were perhaps his way of punishing himself for his failures as a father. Judge Henderson's ruling was comprehensive and groundbreaking. Not only did she declare all eviction proceedings null and void due to Richard Conway's lack of legal standing, but she also ordered a full investigation into all his real estate dealings. The judgment included substantial penalties for discriminatory practices, with the funds to be directed toward fair housing initiatives in the community. But the story's most powerful moment came when Robert Conway Sr. announced his decision to transfer ownership of the Richardsons' home directly to them, at a price far below market value, as compensation for their ordeal and in recognition of Judge Richardson's past help in saving the property. The elderly man's eyes sparkled as he watched the Richardson children realize they would never have to leave their beloved home. The courtroom erupted in applause, but the day's surprises weren't over. Richard Conway's estranged daughter, having followed the case in the news, arrived with her family just as the proceedings concluded. The sight of his grandchildren, clutching handmade cards that read, "We forgive you, Grandpa," cracked the last of Conway's walls. In the courthouse hallway, two families began the difficult but vital work of healing, the Conways confronting generations of prejudice, and the Richardsons demonstrating the power of forgiveness. Sarah Richardson, ever the healer, was the first to reach out to Conway's daughter, forming an unexpected bridge between the families. As reporters gathered outside clamored for statements, Judge Michael Richardson declined to comment on the case itself but offered a simple observation. Justice isn't just about punishments and remedies. Sometimes it's about transformation of hearts, of minds, and of communities. The story's impact rippled far beyond that courtroom. Real estate agencies across the state began reviewing their policies. Community organizations reported increased involvement in fair housing initiatives. And in the Richardsons' neighborhood, the following weekend's block party saw the highest attendance in years, with Robert Conway Sr. as the guest of honor, his son quietly helping him navigate the crowds, both men beginning their own journey of redemption. The Richardson children still play in their front yard, but now they sometimes have new playmates, their former landlord's grandchildren, and on the porch where Conway once delivered eviction notices, two families occasionally share meals, their stories serving as a powerful reminder that justice, compassion, and change are always possible, even in the most unexpected places. In the months that followed the landmark case, the ripple effects of justice continued to transform the community. The Richardsons' Victorian home, now legally theirs, became a symbol of hope and change. They painted the wraparound porch a warm welcome blue, the same color Sarah had always dreamed of but never dared to request from their landlord. The fresh paint seemed to represent the fresh start that touched not just their family, but the entire neighborhood. Richard Conway, guided by his father's wisdom and his own hard-learned lessons, began the challenging work of auditing his entire real estate business. He hired a diverse team of consultants to help reshape his company's policies, turning his experience into an opportunity for genuine change. The man who once tried to push families out was now working to create inclusive housing opportunities across the city. The most remarkable transformation, though, was personal. Every Sunday afternoon, Conway could be seen at his father's facility, wheelchair in hand, taking the elder Conway to the park where both Richardson and Conway children played together. The sight of former adversaries sharing family picnics became a powerful testament to the possibility of change. Sarah Richardson started a community health initiative focusing on stress-related health issues in families facing housing discrimination. Her clinic became a safe space where people could seek both medical care and resources for fighting housing inequality. The waiting room walls displayed artwork created by local children, including a particularly touching piece showing two houses connected by a rainbow bridge, created jointly by the Richardson and Conway grandchildren. Judge Michael Richardson, while maintaining his professional dignity on the bench, began mentoring young law students interested in civil rights and fair housing law. He never directly referenced his personal experience, but his insights carried the weight of someone who had lived through the issues he was teaching about. His chambers became a place where future lawyers learned that justice wasn't just about laws. It was about understanding the human stories behind every case. Robert Conway Sr., despite his physical challenges, found renewed purpose in life. He worked with local housing rights organizations, using his decades of real estate experience to help identify and prevent discriminatory practices. His testimony from the trial became required viewing in fair housing training programs across the state. The neighborhood itself underwent a subtle but significant change. Block parties became more frequent, front porches more occupied, and community meetings more diverse. The Garden Club, once an exclusive gathering, now represented every corner of the community, with members exchanging not just gardening tips but life stories and cultural traditions. 1 year after the trial, the community gathered for a special celebration. It wasn't officially about the case. It was nominally a neighborhood anniversary celebration, but everyone knew what they were really commemorating. Under strings of lights in the Richardsons' backyard, former adversaries shared meals and laughter. Children who might never have played together chased fireflies across the lawn. As the evening wound down, Robert Conway Sr., his voice stronger now, shared a simple observation that captured the journey they'd all taken. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, but what matters most is not the storm itself, but what we build together after it passes. The story of the judge and the landlord became more than just a viral moment or a legal precedent. It became a reminder that justice, when combined with compassion and courage, can transform not just laws but hearts. In the end, the true victory wasn't just in keeping a house. It was in building a home for understanding, redemption, and hope that would last for generations to come. And so, in a quiet Boston suburb, behind the doors of a blue Victorian house, two families continue to write new chapters in their shared story, proof that even the deepest divides can be bridged when people choose to see beyond their prejudices and recognize the humanity in each other.